It was a cold, foggy October night, and the college campus was unusually quiet. Sarah, a diligent but often anxious student, had stayed late in the library to finish an assignment. The campus was known for its rich history and towering old buildings, but it also had a darker side, filled with rumors of eerie occurrences that made the rounds every year, especially during Halloween season. As Sarah gathered her things to leave, she realized that she had lost track of time. The clock on the library wall showed it was past midnight. She quickly packed her bag and left the empty library, the heavy wooden doors creaking as they closed behind her. Her footsteps echoed across the silent courtyard, and the only light came from dim street lamps flickering in the distance. Suddenly she felt a cold breeze behind her, the kind of chill that didn't just touch the skin. It gripped her bones. She turned around but saw nothing, just the fog creeping over the cobblestone paths. Dismissing it as a late-night chill, she pulled her jacket tighter and walked faster. But as she passed the old chemistry building, she heard it. Faint footsteps behind her. At first she thought it was another late student, but the steps were uneven, almost dragging. She glanced over her shoulder and froze. Through the mist, she saw a figure, tall, cloaked, and moving unnaturally slow. Its face, if it had one, was obscured by the shadows. Panic surged through her, and she quickened her pace, but the figure followed, maintaining the same eerie distance. Her mind raced. The campus security building was too far. Her dorm was closer, but to get there, she had to pass through the darkest part of the campus, the old chapel courtyard. It was a place most students avoided after dark, not just because of the lack of light, but because of the stories about students who disappeared. Heart pounding, Sarah made her decision and sprinted towards the dorm, praying the figure wouldn't follow. But as she reached the chapel courtyard, the fog thickened and her vision became blurry. It was as though the air itself was closing in on her. Then she heard it again, louder this time, dragging footsteps, but closer. She dared not look back. She could feel the presence, the weight of eyes, or something worse, watching her. She turned the corner, nearly tripping on the uneven cobblestones, and ran headlong into a tall, dark shape. Sarah screamed, but it was muffled as cold, bony fingers wrapped around her mouth. She struggled, her mind a whirl of terror and confusion. Just as she was about to lose hope, the grip loosened. The figure leaned closer, and in a raspy whisper, it said, "You can't escape them." Suddenly the hand released her, and the figure vanished into the mist, leaving her alone, gasping for breath. Trembling, Sarah glanced around, but the courtyard was empty. No footsteps, no shadows. The fog began to lift, and the dim lights of her dorm were finally in sight. She sprinted the last few yards and burst through the door, slamming it shut behind her. She leaned against the cold wall, trying to calm her racing heart. Safe at last, or so she thought. As Sarah fumbled for her keys to unlock her dorm room, she noticed something strange. Her door was already slightly ajar. She was certain she had locked it before leaving. Her heart sank. Slowly, she pushed the door open. Inside, her room was dark, but something felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, as though something unseen was watching her. She reached for the light switch, but before she could flip it, she heard a faint whisper coming from the corner of the room. "Welcome back, Sarah. We've been waiting." Her blood ran cold. She turned, and there, standing in the darkest corner of her room, was the same cloaked figure, its face still hidden in shadows. The last thing Sarah heard was the door softly clicking shut behind her, sealing her fate. Days passed, and the news of Sarah's disappearance spread across the campus like wildfire. Whispers filled the halls, students nervously glancing over their shoulders as if they too could feel the growing sense of dread in the air. The official story was that Sarah had left campus. Family matters, they said, but her friends knew better. They had seen the way she looked in those final days, her eyes shadowed with fear, always glancing over her shoulder as though she was being followed. Rachel, Sarah's roommate, was particularly shaken. She had been the first to discover the empty room that morning, Sarah's belongings left untouched, her bed perfectly made, as if she had never returned. The campus authorities searched the grounds but found no sign of her. As days turned into weeks, the college moved on, and the story of Sarah was quickly buried under the weight of midterms and assignments. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. One night, as the autumn winds howled outside, Rachel sat alone in her room, staring at Sarah's empty bed. She hadn't been able to sleep since that night. Every sound, every creak of the old dorm sent shivers down her spine. She had tried talking to others about Sarah, but no one seemed to care. The college administration acted as though Sarah had never existed. Rachel decided to take matters into her own hands. She needed answers. Late that night, she ventured to the library, determined to uncover any information she could about the strange history of the campus. As she walked through the shadowed halls, her footsteps echoed eerily in the silence. The library was vast, its towering shelves filled with ancient books and dusty records. Rachel made her way to the restricted section, an area few students dared to explore. It was said that the oldest records of the college, including documents on the campus's construction and past disappearances, were kept there. With trembling hands, she pushed open the creaky door. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of old paper filled her nose. She scanned the shelves, her eyes catching titles that sent chills down her spine. Unexplained events of campus grounds, the forgotten students, hauntings of Hollow Chapel. One book in particular caught her attention. It was old, its leather cover cracked and worn. The title read, "The Night of Shadows." Rachel pulled it from the shelf and sat down at one of the dimly lit study tables. As she opened the book, she was met with pages filled with old newspaper clippings and accounts of mysterious disappearances dating back over a century. The stories were all too familiar. Students vanishing in the night, sightings of shadowy figures, and strange occurrences around the old chapel courtyard. The most disturbing part was that these events happened every few decades, always around the same time of year, October. The last recorded disappearance was in 1984, when a student named Mark O'Connor had vanished without a trace, just like Sarah. Rachel's heart raced as she continued reading. Near the end of the book was a page that made her blood run cold. It was a sketch, rough and hurried, but unmistakable. The same cloaked figure Sarah had described seeing in the days leading up to her disappearance. Underneath the sketch was a warning, written in shaky handwriting. "The shadows come for those who see them. If you see them, they will follow you. They cannot be escaped." Rachel slammed the book shut, her hands shaking. Was this what had happened to Sarah? Had she seen something she wasn't supposed to? The thought made Rachel's stomach churn, but she had to know more. She spent the next several hours poring over every piece of information she could find. But the more she read, the more a dreadful realization began to sink in. The shadows didn't just target anyone. They chose their victims. And once you were marked, there was no escape. As dawn approached, Rachel's exhaustion caught up with her. She packed up the books, returning them to their dusty shelves, but as she was about to leave, something strange happened. The air in the library grew icy, and the lights flickered. She froze, her breath visible in the sudden cold. Slowly she turned towards the far end of the room. There, standing just beyond the dim light, was a tall, cloaked figure. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Rachel knew it was watching her. Fear gripped her, and her legs felt like lead as she backed away, her heart thudding in her chest. The figure took a step forward, its feet making no sound on the old wooden floor. Then just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the darkness. But Rachel knew. The shadows had found her. She sprinted out of the library, her heart racing, but no matter how fast she ran, the feeling of being watched never left her. The shadows had chosen her now. That night, Rachel barricaded herself in her dorm room, but she knew it was only a matter of time. The stories were true. The shadows couldn't be escaped, and like Sarah, her time was running out. The next morning, her friends knocked on her door, concerned that she hadn't shown up for class. There was no answer. When the dorm staff finally unlocked the door, they found the room empty, Rachel's bed untouched, her belongings left behind. Another student had vanished, and once again the campus buried the truth. But the shadows were still out there, waiting for their next victim. Weeks turned into months, and Rachel's disappearance became just another unsolved mystery on campus. The college administration was quick to dismiss any talk of supernatural forces, reassuring the students that Rachel had left due to personal reasons. But among the students, whispers of the shadows continued to spread, and fear lingered in the air, especially as Halloween approached. However, not everyone was content to let the matter drop. Tom, a close friend of Rachel's, couldn't accept the official story. He had known Rachel better than anyone, and she wasn't the type to just vanish. She'd always been level-headed and curious, which is why he knew something darker was at play. He had seen how obsessed she became with Sarah's disappearance, and he feared Rachel had uncovered something that got her into trouble. Determined to find out what happened to his friend, Tom started his own investigation. He began talking to other students, piecing together the strange events surrounding Sarah and Rachel. One name kept coming up in hushed conversations: Professor Hargrove, a history professor who had been at the college for decades. Some students said he knew more about the campus's dark past than he let on. Others claimed he had a fascination with the supernatural. Tom decided to pay him a visit. One cold evening, he made his way to the professor's office. The old building was nearly deserted, its corridors dimly lit and filled with the faint smell of old books. When Tom knocked on the door, it creaked open, revealing Professor Hargrove sitting behind his desk, reading an ancient leather-bound tome. "Ah, Tom," the professor said, his voice gravelly but calm. "I've been expecting you." Tom was taken aback. "You knew I was coming?" Professor Hargrove nodded slowly. Word travels fast on this campus, especially when it comes to matters of the shadows. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. He sat down, not sure how to start. "I need to know what happened to Rachel and Sarah," he said, his voice firm. "I know something's wrong here. People are disappearing, and no one is talking about it." The professor leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "What do you know about the chapel courtyard?" Tom frowned. "Just that it's an old, creepy part of campus. Most people avoid it." "That's because they're smart," Professor Hargrove said, his tone darkening. "The chapel was built over a century ago, but it was never meant for worship. It was built as a monument, an offering, if you will, to forces beyond our understanding. Tom's heart raced as the professor continued. The land this campus is built on has a dark history. Long before the college was founded, the area was the site of strange rituals, ancient rites performed by those who believed in summoning entities from beyond. They believed these entities could grant power, knowledge, but at a terrible price. Tom leaned forward, his mouth dry. The shadows? Yes, Professor Hargrove said quietly. The shadows are not ghosts or spirits. They are something older, darker. They are beings drawn to places of fear, where the boundaries between our world and theirs are thin. And once someone sees them, they become marked. Tom's stomach twisted. So Rachel, she was marked. The professor nodded. Rachel, like Sarah before her, became too curious. She started seeing the shadows, and once they set their sights on you, there's no escape. They feed on fear, and they thrive in places like the courtyard, places steeped in centuries of dark energy. Tom felt a wave of hopelessness wash over him. Is there no way to stop them? Professor Hargrove's expression darkened. There is no stopping them, Tom. The shadows have been here long before us, and they will be here long after we're gone. But there is one thing you can do. Avoid them. Don't look for them. Don't acknowledge them, and for God's sake, stay away from the chapel courtyard. Tom left the professor's office that night with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. He needed to stay away from the shadows. Yet as much as he tried to heed the professor's warning, something inside him, maybe it was the need for closure or the fear of leaving his friend's fate unresolved, drove him to investigate further. The night of Halloween arrived, and with it, the thick swirling fog that seemed to roll in every year. Tom had made up his mind. He would visit the chapel courtyard one last time, hoping to find some clue, something that could explain what had happened to Sarah, Rachel, and the others. As midnight approached, Tom stood at the edge of the courtyard, the eerie silence pressing in around him. The fog swirled low to the ground, obscuring the cobblestones. The old chapel loomed in the distance, its stained glass windows dark and foreboding. The air was thick with the sense that something unnatural was watching. Despite the professor's warning, Tom stepped into the courtyard. At first, there was nothing, just silence, the weight of history pressing down on him. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a shadow shifting just beyond the edge of the fog. His heart pounded in his chest. He turned slowly, his breath caught in his throat. The shadowy figure stood at the far end of the courtyard, its form barely distinguishable, but unmistakably watching him. Tom's mind screamed at him to run, but his feet were frozen. The figure moved, gliding toward him without a sound, its cloak billowing unnaturally. His body finally responded, and he stumbled back, desperate to escape. But the fog thickened around him, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Suddenly, another figure appeared in front of him, blocking his path. Then another, and another. The shadows were closing in, surrounding him, their presence suffocating, feeding off his fear. Tom tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the fog. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was a familiar face. Rachel, standing among the shadows, her eyes empty, her expression cold. She whispered, "It's too late, Tom. They've already taken you." And with that, the shadows closed in. The next morning, the campus was silent. Another student had disappeared, but like the others, the story was quickly buried. The chapel courtyard remained empty, its dark history forgotten by most. But for those who knew the truth, The shadows were still out there, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble into their grasp. And once they had you, there was no escape.